appropriate European law on consumer contracts is not being applied in cases of home repossession orders granted in the Circuit Court. And the Master of the High Court, Edmond Honahan, joins us now in studio. What EU law is not being applied here, and what's its significance?
Yeah, well, we should all be familiar with the terms of the Lisbon Treaty. I think we voted on it twice. You should know it backwards. A Charter of Fundamental Rights in the European law. And what's interesting about it is that the Charter was not regarded initially as being of legal significance. Somebody described it as being as important as the Beano. It was an English politician, I can imagine. But in fact, it has become an aid to interpretation of the principles of consumer law, which are one of the areas in which consumer law or community law operates throughout the community. Surprisingly, you might think EU law is about the free market and stuff like that, but in fact it also deals with the rights of consumers.
And so we're talking about mortgage contracts here, is that it?
Yeah, the mortgage contract is always a double contract. There's always a facility, that's to say an initial loan, a facility letter, and the loan is then comes with a condition, which is that there should be a security attached to it. That's to say the house should be signed over to the lender. And the question is whether or not the terms of such a contract contain a term which is unfair. That's a very difficult topic. The community directive in that regard was incorporated into Irish law, word for word, in 1993. But it has been swept under the carpet really to a large extent, and people have proceeded in court and elsewhere on the basis of pre-existing law about the equitable balance and forbearance and allowing people a certain dignity in relation to their dealings with the commercial world. But the European law has, as I say, attempted to create a level playing pitch throughout the community by imposing on every member state an obligation. And that obligation, I'll just pause for a moment and remind you that European law is made up of some common law countries, and the bulk of them are code law countries. So in a country which is governed by the Napoleonic Code or its derivatives, the judges have a function which is more of an investigative function. They don't sit around and wait for lawyers to come in on both sides. They actually get stuck in and call in witnesses to their own.
So you're saying our system is not prepared to take advantage of the protections that are there under European law for people who may find themselves under the threat of repossession?
Well, the phrase "take advantage" is an appropriate one here, because we're not dealing with one side or the other. The point I'm making is that the Irish courts have not addressed themselves to their responsibility under the Charter to procure and obtain effective judicial protection for the consumer. Look at that phrase, effective judicial protection. That involves the court, or in the case of Circuit Court, a registrar, actually, for starters, reading the papers, even if the defendant doesn't show up. And of its own motion, the court is supposed to investigate whether or not there's an unfair term. Now, I'm not saying that 9 cases out of 10 you're going to find the mortgage deed contains an unfair term, but there may be cases in which a particular type of mortgage may be regarded as being unfairly burdensome on the borrower.
Do you think that there were possibly some repossessions which may have been granted which perhaps shouldn't have?
Oh, absolutely. There's a kind of a perfect storm in the Circuit Court at the moment. We already know from a decision of the Court of Appeal that the jurisdiction of the Circuit Court to deal with domestic residences was questionable. The previous act was regarded as not being satisfactory, and many of the orders for repossession that have been made are in fact void. I don't think the public realises that. The decision was last July that many of the decisions made in the Circuit Court are void, and people shouldn't be losing sleep over them. Got no publicity, of course. That's the first thing that happened. Then there's a issue about the 2013 Act as to whether or not the principal place of residence is the basis for jurisdiction of the Circuit Court. I had a case before me a couple of weeks ago in which a couple came in and said they wanted to appeal a Circuit Court decision because the house that had been repossessed was not their principal place of residence. They had been living in Australia. And we have a similar situation where one of the defendants lives in the house and another defendant doesn't. So the Circuit Court jurisdiction is very, very questionable at this stage. That's only for starters. If you take the EU Charter as being a further deepening of the responsibility on the Circuit Court registrar or the Circuit Court judge, you find that, in fact, the judges and the registrars are simply saying, we don't want to go there. European law is something that is, if you like, foreign to the Irish legal tradition. And it's necessary for people now to sit up and say, let us look again at these contracts to see whether or not the consumer was given a fair deal.
So is the onus here on solicitors representing people who are under the threat of repossession to sit up and take notice of this existing European law, or is there something that the system needs to put in place to ensure that everybody can take advantage of all the protections that are out there?
I think the government has already acknowledged the fact that their policy has been to push people towards insolvency, but they've realised that...
Well, they might contest that.
Yes, they've realised that they need to assist people, even under EU law, by way of legal aid, and in this regard, they're now providing a voucher system. But the vouchers that are being offered to solicitors up and down the country are for paltry sums of money. And I think, unfortunately, there's a fatalism about repossession, a presumption that a borrower in default has no defence. That's everybody thinks that's the case, and a solicitor who gets the voucher and who accepts the voucher will say, well, if you're in arrears, I'm sorry, there's not much I can do for you. There is a lot that can be done. I've come across dozens of cases where the paperwork even is defective.
Okay. All right, Edmond Honahan, Master of the High Court. Lots of food for thought there for those who may be facing the threat of repossession. Thanks for coming into us this lunchtime. More on the news.
It's not private. He has no warrant. He has no warrant. The person is stressed enough. He has no warrant. What is he doing? Here without a warrant. What are you doing here without a warrant? Look at this scum on the side again. Look at them. Fucking pricks. What's wrong with the warrant? It's a sign for you. It's not for you. It's a sign by it's not addressed. It's not public property. It's not addressed to you. Yeah. But it's signed by a judge. Patrick Joseph. You're not named on the warrant, so it's not addressed to you. And we'll leave you do whatever you want if you have a warrant. Yeah, show us the warrant. I mean, it's the last time we asked him to show the warrant. I've seen the warrant 2 days ago. I don't see. Show us the warrant. You're here stealing someone's house. So if you want to steal, I'm not. Just say, why are you shouting again? You're here trying to. Why is the shouting? What's the shouting for? You're saying I'm shouting. Yeah, almost, yeah. This is fine here with balaclavas and stuff, is it? I'm private property. Can you tell me what's that man road traffic act? Can you tell me what your colleague is doing? I'm asking you. Can you tell me what your colleague is doing? I don't know that man. I'm not calling him saying he's committed any crime because he's not. I don't know that man. There's no crimes for putting on. Who are you protecting here? There's no crime for putting on protected. I'm not covering up places that I'm in uniform. Is there a crime for covering up license plates and not having tax discs or NCT or insurance? Tax and insurance. That car has no tax, no insurance, no NCT. I will check that out afterwards. I'm dealing with one job at a time. And it's perfectly legal as well. I'm not. I'm just shut the camera in my face. I think you fucked up about 100 times. Look, 5 minutes. I just want proof. That's all. When you lied over there just 5 minutes ago, which I have proof of already, you're all on this side. You're all on this side. You said you were going to see this side, and you said you're blatantly covering up a road traffic act, and you're blatantly covering up heavies in balaclavas, and they have no warrant. And you're just with no warrant. But you know it. Show us the warrant. Show us the warrant. He just asked down here. He just asked. He's not down here. He wants to know. I've explained to him. So everybody's trespassing here. And show me the warrant. No, you are trespassing here. It has to be treated very seriously. We are treating this very seriously.
We're trespassing without any paperwork.
Show me the warrant. There is no warrant to show, that's why. What's your name? Sorry.